going to be talking about history of urban forestry. And I know people are like, oh man, we're going to go through history. This won't be too bad. It's kind of interesting actually how we got to the mindset where we are. And so I want to ask a question out to the whole class. What's the oldest profession on earth? Nobody's brave enough to say what they're thinking. Prostitution, that's usually what I get. The oldest profession on earth. Well, no, see, I'm going to straighten everybody out here. See, it's gardening, tending the garden, taking care of plants. So everybody that's in here is involved in the oldest profession on earth. You know, at the Garden of Eden, they're kind of naked, but they're real small, so you can't see it. So if we look at how this started, we've been taking care of plants for a very long time. And so just kind of looking, we're going to go through this fairly quickly. But you know, one of the questions, why do we need to study history? You know, history's a pain. History's a bunch of dead people and stuff that's that happened a long time ago. But you've probably heard this saying, those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We kind of keep doing that in politics all the time. But also, something important I think in this class is history is philosophy teaching by example. So we can look at some other examples and see things of why people did certain things and how we may adapt that to what we're doing. We're going to look at history from two aspects. First, we're going to look at ancient history of urban forestry, and I'm using that loosely because we're kind of talking about just trees and people's perceptions. So we're going to go back. We're going to start about 7,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, a long time. And just look at a few places on the timeline. Then we're going to jump to history of urban forestry in America. If we look back in 5800 BC, in the time of the Sumerians, you know, you kind of see the old map here, Sumer, Babylonia. Looks really familiar to us today, even though we were, you know, took American history or American geography and don't know our geography very well. We go, oh, that's kind of like those Iraq pictures that are on the news. So, and what is Iraq and the Middle East today? Back in ancient times in Samaria is where we get our first writings about trees, and these were on clay tablets. You may have heard the story about the Gilgamesh epics and the Garden of Cedars, and so these are illustrated on earthen tablets. Okay, the bad part of the story is Gilgamesh kind of cut down all the cedars, so it's maybe not a real good example of urban forestry, but it is our first example of dealing with trees in that area of Mesopotamia, meaning between the rivers. Then in about 4000 BC, so we're moving up a couple thousand years, this is our earliest known use of tree planting for parks in Samaria. And you can see the picture of the ziggurat there, and the Mesopotamian god who came down. See, they used trees and that kind of thing in their religious art. So trees were important to people a very long time ago. We go up to about 3500 BC and start looking at the Egyptians. This is our earliest known transport of trees. So when we look in the old pictographs, and Queen Hatshepsut, who was a pharaoh of Egypt, kind of an interesting gal. Her husband was pharaoh and died, and so then she like wore a fake beard and man's clothes, and interesting story. But there are pictographs of people transporting trees in containers, and so we think about the nursery industry being something fairly recent. But as far back as 3500 BC, they were moving frankincense trees in containers. Also, kind of interesting, the Egyptians are known as the father of arboriculture. So they started practicing this a very long time ago. Trees being very important. Moving up to 1500 BC, still the Egyptians are a major power, and we start seeing pictures of trees being transported in ships, big trees, when we look at some of those. And so they were moving trees from a very long distance. About 1,500 miles they were transporting trees to a royal park. So that's kind of amazing for us to think now, but you know, they built pyramids, so what's a big tree in a boat moving at a long distance? Then we go up to about 1200 BC. And this is kind of maybe Gilgamesh's great-great-great-grandson. But this is when the deforestation of the famous cedars of Lebanon that you've probably heard about, when this occurred. And so this started creating in the minds of people a respect for trees and some desire to preserve them, because by about 1000 BC, the giant cedars of Lebanon had almost disappeared, and they were used by every ruler that was in power. And you know, if you read in the Bible, Solomon, they were sent for building Solomon's temple, and so they used a lot of them. But people started wanting to preserve these trees, which is kind of a concept that we don't have records of people having before that time. Also, not just looking over in the Middle East, but looking in Asia. And when we see the Zhou dynasty, it's spelled Chow and pronounced Joe. I don't know why that is, but the Zhou dynasty, we start seeing people planting trees for shade. They planted trees along the major roads for shade for the travelers that were moving from place to place. Go up to about 600 BC. Now we're talking about the earliest known tree protection laws. Okay, this was during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Now we're looking to figure out what the 7 wonders of the modern world are, if you've been keeping up with that. But this is when we had our earliest known tree protection laws in Babylon.